No, and I think the only thing that I would add, and that was like just so on point, is also thinking when we're talking about a phone, like Mohammed said earlier, we're really talking about a computer. So all those functions, etc. Like that's really what we're talking about. Yeah. And then I think the other thing that I would highlight that y'all have done really good work on is kind of if you're naturalized citizens, how potentially you have less rights to be protected from surveillance than if you are a natural-born citizen.
Okay. Well, it just brings to mind on my landline, every time Dale Gronemeyer calls me or I call him, there's this little click that happens. It doesn't happen with other people. So I figure somebody's doing something. Anyway, another question is, what can we as individuals do to preserve our privacy online and with other government incursions?
Yeah, I think y'all are doing that already. I think by coming together and having these conversations and not letting the chilling effect of, I don't understand the law because the law is not very clear, I don't understand the technology because damn, does it move so fast. I think by coming together and having these conversations, that's step one of how to beat back the stalker state. Then there are folks like the EFF, and don't actually help with a lot of the material we've developed. So there is material. I think that in LA we're lucky. There's a group in Culver City, Crash Space, that is a hacker space, and every now and then, or maker space, every now and then they'll help people secure their devices. So I'd say find partners in this. So and this goes back to what I said earlier, a diversity of tactics. We don't need to be technology experts to fight back the stalker state. Yeah,
I agree. I think the other way is just to sort of like do the kind of, for me, I think to going back to Ken's point about sort of the people power, I think frankly that's really the most important thing to do to sort of protect our privacy. There's things that we can do sort of individually that Ken's referring to, right? Like protecting our phone nominally, or practicing safe internet browsing and things like that. That's all well and good. There's things you can do about that. But I think the more interesting and frankly the more impactful work is to sort of start to get together and think about these things as collectives, like in this space. Start to plug into some organizations who are doing this kind of work, like the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, particularly for folks in LA. Connecting with them and like participating with the work that they're doing, or creating your own sort of organizations, doing whatever it is that you need to do to kind of help to generate a conversation, and using that kind of momentum and that advocacy to then turn around and sort of attack the levers of power wherever they might be, whether that's sort of a local sort of municipality, whether that's a police department, whether that's like a school that you think is playing funny games with like your kids' information, or whatever that might be, sort of turning that, sort of mobilizing that like popular energy and going and sort of doing a little bit about it. And the reality is that even though we're sort of, in some ways, I'm guilty of scaremongering here, I actually think that it's really not that. I don't actually think it's really that hard, and in part because there are diversity of tactics, as Ken was saying. Like there's a role for everybody to play. There's a role for everyone to play, and there's all kinds of things that we can do, and all kinds of targets for where we can make meaningful change. And so I actually don't think it's that difficult to really do that kind of work.
I'm actually going to add a little bit more to that. So in March, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is having a training. I've completely blanked about it. And it's based on a Power Not Paranoia curriculum that we developed. So when we developed that curriculum, one of the things we're very conscious of is, at least for me, I do a lot of organizational security work. You can only move as fast as the slowest person. You can only be as secure as the most insecure node on your network. So for us, we have a very collective model of we need to do the political piece, and then we also need to do the technology piece. So as more information comes out about that, I'll make sure to share that with Dick and Sharon. Yeah.
And you came in late, and just one more question, and we're going to go to the audience.
I'm the part of the audience.
I know. Your time is coming. I just wanted to mention that on the sheet that most of you have that were on your seat is a list of resources, and 2 of them are from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Surveillance Self-Defense, and 5 EFF tools to help you protect you online, and I guess they're limited from what you say, but still a step in the right direction. Yeah. Okay. The last question that I have, and we will get to questions from all of you, is any success stories of communities or scaling back local police surveillance?
Yeah, so I mean, and I think that part of it is, what do we consider success? So like, let's say a very recent success that the Stop OPD Coalition had was in the drone fight, where initially we had succeeded in grounding some drones that Seattle, thanks Seattle, had gifted the LAPD. The LAPD decided, well, you know, we actually do want drones because we like stalking people. And so they went through this bogus process to get community buy-in to the drones. People turned out, people said they didn't want the drones, and the LAPD, being the LAPD, went ahead and they're deploying their drones. For us, that was actually a huge victory because it unmasked it was really reassuring to see people don't want to be stalked by the LAPD. It also was the unmasking and the demystifying that the LAPD is not open to community input, which, you know, has kind of been the history of the LAPD. The LAPD has a very sordid history when it comes to surveilling and stalking folks and disrupting social movements. So for us, that like very clear, like in Spanish we have a wonderful word called descarado, like without a face. It was so shameless. But for us, that was like a very clear victory because it forces people to pick a side. There is no neutrality in this.
When did you stop?
We did not stop it. We did not stop it the second time.
Victory.
No, you stopped it the first time.
The first time we stopped it, yeah.
Yeah, I think another quick recent example of this. This actually just happened last week, right? So remember I mentioned the automatic license plate reader company called Vigilant Solutions, right? So the city of Alameda, delightful island in the Bay Area, it had on its agenda a contract to expand its automatic license plate reader system in the city, presumably to keep the coloreds from Oakland out of the city, essentially, to monitor them. I mean, I think that's kind of what's going on in the city of Alameda. But basically, had up for a vote a contract with Vigilant Solutions to expand its automatic license plate reader technology. I think it would have been a $500,000 purchase. I think that's right. I think I got my number right. But following a whole bunch of organizing that was done by a whole bunch of folks in the Bay Area, and included a number of organizations, including the ACLU, EFF, the Oakland Privacy Commission, a bunch of other folks, they successfully got the city of Alameda to basically go back to the drawing board and raised, in particular, the problem of ICE's access to automatic license plate, to license plate information and location information of residents. And using that, and successfully got the city to say, oh, okay, wait a minute, let's go back to the drawing board here. Now, who knows what can come out of it? Maybe they turn into like the LAPD and like they go forward anyway in a couple of years. Who knows? But that's another sort of concrete example of folks just organizing locally in a small municipality. Alameda's not that big, but we're able to get some really serious victories and essentially retard the progress or the expansion of this Vigilant database across the country. They actually had the muckety mucks from the company from like Tennessee flew in and like presented and stuff, and like a bunch of local folks basically won and got them to go home, right? So this kind of thing can happen, but it takes a little bit of people, like a little bit of mobilizing, but we can get it done.
Even Red Channels, when it came out during the Red Scare, was a for-profit enterprise. The collection of data by these third parties, these private parties, are using it in the most profitable manner. Can you please discuss how that affects our right to privacy?
That is that the part of the problem here is that there is part of what motivates this data collection is the ability to turn this information into profit, and it's not a new thing, as you rightly point out. But I think given these sort of trends, it's a lot easier now to do it than ever before. And I think the government is in cahoots with the private sector on doing this kind of on sort of mobilizing this information for private profit. There are good examples for Well, the government does this in really interesting and sort of like in collaborative ways, right? So the government exploits private collection of information quite readily. So Amazon Alexa is a really good example of this, right? And all of your home devices that have microphones in them. So Alexa, basically, speaker that has a microphone that hears everything you say, and when you say Alexa, it does a thing for you, like a menial task, right? So Amazon stores all of the things you say, all that it hears on that device, whether or not you're tapping Alexa to do something for you. So the government it conveniently is able to tap that information to get access to the recordings that Alexa made about you in ways that can serve its own ends, and conveniently allows, sort of proliferates this sort of fun relationship between Amazon and the government. Obviously, Amazon, this came up when, in the case of investigating I believe it was a murder or something, that the government wanted to use as a piece of evidence the recordings made by Alexa to attack an alibi made by a defendant. That the defendant was not at the home where the murder was. So the government was like, no, wait a minute, Alexa caught you. Right, so Alexa, give me those recordings. So there's a fight between the government and Amazon about this. But the point of this being is that there's this sort of web of relationships between the government and the private sector in ways that I think are mutually beneficial and that support the ability of the state to conduct the kinds of things that we're concerned about. I guess that's what I'd say.
I think that nails it. I think that there is, I really like the adjective you used, which is insidious, because that's what it is. Because it is so opaque how this happens, that it's not transparent or clear to anyone exactly where does the private state end and the public state begin. So within that liminal space, how a lot of bad things can happen, how a lot of end runs. I think I didn't know that Pasadena was contracted to Spokio. That's super creepy. And it's really important that y'all are engaged in that fight. But then I think that's the other thing, is that within this, there are so many moving pieces to this, so many actors, where it could be, an innocuous tech startup that's funded for who's not really, no one's really clear what they do, but people throw millions of dollars at them, and then 5 years later, it's oh yeah, that was Palantir, a CIA startup, and surprise, surprise, bad stuff happens. And then I think if we look at how horrible these things can be, it's still unclear what Tiger Swan, the mercenaries who were harming the folks protecting the waters from the Dakota Access Pipeline, exactly the amount of corporate surveillance that was happening there. There are folks still working on FOIA and PRA or whatever permutation is appropriate for the Dakotas to figure out exactly what was Tiger Swan collecting, and were they sharing that with the sheriffs in North Dakota.
Or they cherry picking it, which they did.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in light of or in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations, and some of the laws, passed by Congress, have there been any checks at all placed on the reach of the NSA, or should we still pretty much assume that it's open season on our digital and telephonic communications?
If you look like me, or if your name is Muhammad, it's always been open season.
Yeah.
So, but with the Snowden, I don't know if revelations, but with what Snowden shared, I think that the best evidence of how far we've come was it just two weeks ago, 702 reauthorization? So Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the Democrats completely folded on that. So there is no additional protection. We're pretty much still in the same space.
Sunshine.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thanks, Sunshine. To answer your question, to echo on those, I think the reality is there were some kind of nominal reforms that were done, the bulk metadata collection program, I think, was ended, maybe, and then there are other end runs around it. So there's an executive order that does a lot of that work. FISA is still in play. Section 702 authorization is still in play. The web is so sort of there are a lot of like legal loopholes to get around particular reforms that I think is a functional matter. I actually think, like, while I don't actually think very much has changed. I guess that's the kind of long and short of what I think. And so while I think the revelations themselves are really important for creating a kind of national conversation, I actually don't think it ultimately resulted in really much reform. And I think it's in part because there is essentially a national consensus on the value of like the intelligence community and the surveillance state that Ken's alluding to. And I think that's kind of what happened.
About 6 years ago, I was stopped on the PCH. And I didn't know why, and there was a patrol car to my left, and kind of like scoping in at me. It was around midnight, and then went in back of me. So I slowed down, I put my hazard lights on, and I stopped at the nearest store that I saw. And because of that, I got a point for failure to yield to an emergency vehicle, even though I told the officer I was driving for my safety, which is what they tell women to do. And I went to the city council, and what happened in the course of the time of me speaking out, this was wrong, that I had to pay $500,000 for my safety, when it's actually in the DMV driver's manual that you can do this. I found out that there was this woman, young black woman, Mitrice Richardson. She was arrested for not paying a restaurant bill, right, even though she actually had the money in her car, whatnot. She had some sort of mental episode going on. They took her to the jail, they released her in the middle of the night.
What's your question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to give a little background because it goes in with this. So anyway, they released her in the middle of the night, and then she was found a year later, deceased, clothes around. What happened is her body was moved without the coroner's permission, and a lot of different things. The sheriff's department was sued. I went to court for my ticket, and my Teresa's family told me that my judge happened to be inquired for her death. Okay, so basically said, yes, I'm trying to get to it. Thank you. I'm really sorry. I'm doing my best. Thank you. Thank you. So since then, I've been getting more information that it's possible that this judge may have been involved, as well as sheriffs, and that's out there. So when I go online, every now and then, I'll look up some information about this judge who treated me very nastily. It's scary, huh? So what I need to know is, when I look up information about this person and about the sheriff department, is this all being tracked? Because it seems like it is. And then I just anonymously made a report to Crime Stoppers a few weeks ago, and it was a very scary situation where she kept putting me on hold. So I'm just wondering, because I'm doing this solo, I'm just wondering how much safety a person has, or anybody who is involved in a hunch or whatnot, that's ever been involved with, there's a crime or whatnot, and investigating.
I would strongly suggest looking at compartmentalization. How do you put your digital life in compartments as a rule, so that you can clearly identify, or with a little bit greater clarity, identify, am I creating risk for a certain identity or aspect of my life? The other thing is, I think some folks like I just generally don't trust the state from go, don't trust judges from go. So that's what I would offer as sympathy.
Some really interesting statistics about the disparity. If you look at demographics, certain groups get a lot of attention and other groups don't get so much attention. So, listening to your presentation, it didn't really come out at you that this isn't kind of just happening like a dragnet across the board. There are some groups that are dragneted more than others. Perhaps activist groups, certainly groups that belong to people of colors. And what Hamid said, which was surprising to me, was that LAPD, South LAPD spying found that black women were like one of the #1 groups. So can you talk to the disparity and who's watching? I just kind of expect, okay, so he said, yeah, you probably watched a lot. So why don't you, if you can, share some information about who is getting more
Yeah,
traction?
I felt that was pretty clear in terms of the context and the mapping that I laid out, that there are certain people and how really surveillance is an exercise in white supremacy and in state violence, and there's also the factor as well that when the South LAPD Spying Coalition did its initial work around rescinding Special Order 11, which was then renamed Special Order 1 because the LAPD always likes to shift the ball on you. So when we did collect those statistics, and similar statistics are playing out with, the laser program. It's Los Angeles Strategic Extraction of something. It's like this horrible program that's like a lot of this. So let's go back even further. When we're talking about this, we're talking about the deployment of counterinsurgency technologies that are used in the illegally occupied West Bank, in Kashmir, in Puerto Rico, and in other colonial imperial territories, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Where this is how the war comes home. This is how the war comes home. And the people who are traditionally, like I said, the canaries in the proverbial coal mine are people who are already at risk. So then we're talking about poor people, we're talking about sex workers, we're talking about black folks, and we're talking about, at a micro level, black women, trans women, we're talking about indigenous women, where those are the people that, so violence against them in this society has been normalized. So it's not a surprise that when we look at what the stalker state does and who it harms, that it's harming the same people. So to think that it would harm different people is kind of some, putting some trust in the state that the state does not deserve. But going to your point, that was one of the findings that and just looking at the black community, where the black community is, I think at that point, was 11 or 12% of LA City, but I think that the SARS were more than 30% black people. And then when you just drill down into black female-bodied folks, it's like, holy cow, none of this is proportionate to anything. It's really just a pretext for racism.
Like a continuation of COINTELPRO.
A continuation of COINTELPRO, a continuation of Jim Crow. These are the people we want to watch. These are the people whose movements we want to limit.
I agree. Yeah. I've got nothing to add. That's not true. I have one thing to add, which is I do think. I think the floor is now higher for the level of broad-based surveillance that everybody is under. But I think the intense focus that poor communities and communities of color have historically been under still remains, right? So I think more people are now under surveillance, but the burden is primarily felt, I think, by folks by sort of the folks on the periphery, right? So one good example, for instance, we're talking about automatic license plate readers, right? One really great way. The NYPD used automatic license plate readers on squad cars to go to mosques in New York and New Jersey to just find out who attends mosques, right? Who's in the Muslim community. And so it would literally just drive past parking lots and just like hoover up like information about who all these people were, just to know like who are these brown Muslims out here doing Muslim stuff. Right, that's just kind of what they do, and that's just sort of a way that this tool is used to perpetuate this sort of like scrutiny that has long been existed over like particularly Muslim communities. That's just one random example, but there's plenty of others. So.
Okay.
Chris, at the beginning of the meeting, you mentioned that the local chapter of the ACLU has a small task force looking at surveillance in our city of Pasadena. And I just want to say a little bit more about that and ask the panel to comment. That the task force has so far just been investigating what's going on, and it includes some of the things we talked about, the license plate readers, the contract with Spokio, and earlier the adoption of body cameras by Pasadena police officers. But our long-term goal in this task force is to get the city of Pasadena to adopt a new law or an ordinance to control the use of surveillance technology, at least within our city. And the ACLU has drafted a model ordinance that we would like our city to adopt, and it has been adopted by a few local governments around here. And some of its points are that before adopting any kind of surveillance technology, there must be an impact study done, and it must be public, and we must understand what's going to happen. And policies for its use have to be developed, and that has to be done publicly. It has to be transparent. The public has to have input to those policies. Because mostly we believe that these technologies are not inherently bad. They have good uses. For example, license plate readers can help find stolen cars. But it's all a matter of how they're used, and having tight and enforceable controls on the use is the way that we might protect ourselves. So I'd like to ask the panel to comment.
To arm basically the public with additional information to be able to scrutinize how local governments are deploying these sort of shiny silver objects of surveillance and these tools in their local communities. One of the problems, as we've discussed, is that often the use of these technologies is done covertly. In fact, most of the time it's done covertly without our knowledge of them. So one way of trying to at least understand what's being used by municipalities is forcing local governments to disclose to have a set of rigorous procedures to disclose when technologies are going to actually be deployed by police departments or by the municipality itself. In that vein, I think the work that Larry's talking about, I think would be helpful for the city of Pasadena, so that instead of us having to hear about the use of all of these technologies, either through when something bad happens or leaked to the press or something, that the public at least has an opportunity at the front end to know this is what's going on and this is what the city is doing or what it intends to do, and then use that information to do the good work of either placing strict limits on it or saying, in fact, no, we don't want this kind of this kind of technology to be used in the city. And that approach, I think, coupled with additional forms of sort of organizing and mobilization, I think can help develop a game plan for local responses to the increasing prevalence of the stalker state. So that's what I would say in response to that.
Yeah, I would offer a somewhat nuanced response, which kind of feels like bull in a china shop, even though I want it to be nuanced. Is the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition believes in the abolition of the stalker state, not the regulation of the stalker state. So that's one of the things that we strongly believe. One of the big dangers with community control is that the community, in a very objective way, should have a say as to how things are deployed in their community. That's part of the democratic principle. The fact of this matter is that we live in a racist country, and the policies that sometimes we design with the best of intentions are not executed objectively. So even if it does follow a very well-studied, well-developed, thoughtfully drafted model ordinance, at the end of the day, there's a lot of subjectivity that is exercised in the implementation of things like model ordinances. The other thing that I would offer is it makes me think a lot about what a legal scholar in Seattle, Dean Spade, calls administrative violence. When we kind of try to regulate these pathways that are supposed to protect people, but really they harm people, but it's done under the guise of law. We went through a legal framework, we voted on X, but the same people keep getting hurt. So maybe there's a pause point here to think about, what is it that we're really creating? Do we want to control the instruments of surveillance and leverage them or deploy them in a way that reflects the prejudices of our community at large? I mean, just think about who's in the White House right now as a grotesque example. As a grotesque example. But just think of all the Mussolinis that preceded that person then, using the same metaphor. So there's a big danger, I feel, to the idea of community control of surveillance. If we're not going to name what our communities are, where some communities are bastions of racism and homophobia, then maybe the community shouldn't control these dangerous instruments, is how I feel about that.
Alluded to that the Muslim community has been a primary target of surveillance. both nationally and locally, since 9/11. And I haven't heard much about that, except a few comments here just recently. One of the things that I was aware of a few years ago is that the LAPD actually announced publicly that they were going to map the Muslim community.
With USC.
What's that?
I think USC was in on that too.
Anyway, but it was very open and public, and it speaks to what Ken was saying about, when the public is prejudiced, then some really nasty things can happen. But anyway, this was challenged by some leadership in the LA Muslim community. And in their challenge, they demanded not only that they stop, but they not continue to do it undercover. I do not, for one, believe that they have stopped doing it.
That history is a good example of how some of these sort of surveillance practices and technologies are deployed to target particularly vulnerable communities. So I think the episode that you're referencing, I forget when it occurred. It must be 6 or 7 years ago, as a way of developing tools to survey the community and to fight against what it deemed to be potential incidents of homegrown radicalization, whatever that means. And following a community outcry, they shelved that program. I sort of am the Muslim community itself has long been the target of programs like this one. And so I agree with you. I actually don't, if it's not this particular mapping program and this particular, as it was designed and constructed, it is something different, it will be something quite different. And there are, I think the Muslim community in particular is a little bit more organized now than it was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to be able to resist these kinds of tactics. And I also think that the Muslim community also has allies in other communities that are ready to step forward and to protect the kind of sort of sovereignty and the rights of the Muslim community in ways that I think are really powerful and important. And so I think that fight, as you mentioned, continues today, and I think they're a particular focus of concern and scrutiny from authorities, both local and national.
And I would just add that there's a current iteration of that fight is within a campaign that you folks are doing, and Stop LAPD Spying is also running kind of a parallel aspect against countering violent extremism. So the mayor's office has received, or departments in the mayor's office have received these countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism grants. These are nothing but tools for racial profiling, and they're allowing nonprofits to make money off it. And I think like MPAC, so I will name them. I think that there's an opportunity for all of us to explore what some people of color, we say not all skin folks are kinfolk, and just thinking how within this, that sometimes there will be people within our communities or traditionally targeted communities who want to collaborate or cooperate with the state, and how sometimes that creates more danger than it creates safety.
I just want to say I work for the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and we're a civic rights and public policy organization that protects the rights of American Muslims, and we have never and would never participate in any police surveillance. I actually am their grant writer, and I wrote the grant under Obama that was under the Countering Violent Extremism program that we've worked to change and to take away any surveillance elements to participate, and we refused to participate because they demanded that we did. And I want to ask the question, because I wrote the grant, I know that there's no police surveillance involved in the grant, and I know that there isn't also in the LA City grant, and that there are actually some programs benefiting Muslim youth. And it's hard for me, as someone who works for that organization, to hear the slander that happens directed at this organization that would never, in a million years, participate in any form of surveillance. And my question is, because we go to the table and talk to authorities and engage on the issue of surveillance and demand that it stop, we get accused of collaborating with authorities, or being our leader of the organization is slandered, and things like that happen. So my question to you is, if we can't stop surveillance by saying stop surveillance. It doesn't change anything. If we hadn't engaged, the Muslim community would be under incredible surveillance right now. And so my question is, what do we really do besides protest to stop surveillance? Because if we don't engage, it will not stop.
That for the Los Angeles Muslim Mapping Project in the early 2000s, MPAC was an advocate and an ally of the LAPD in that. So that's actually in the LA Times.
That's great, but we were not.
So, okay, great. Take that up with the LA Times.
That is wrong.
So, and all that said, I think with countering violent extremism, I think for me, it is a racial profiling program, because why do we need to tell Muslims to behave according to the rules? Shouldn't we be telling everyone to behave according to whatever rules we agree with? As an anti-rules person, that's already problematic. But going beyond that framework, I think that if we are saying, hey, Muslims, you need to prove you're better Americans and Americans, whatever that means, that's problematic. The other thing is the scientific angle on that. So a lot of the framework for that actually comes from the UK, and it is really profiling, soft profiling, that comes from the UK, and it's been shown to be junk science. So, I mean, and I get it, it's really hard, nonprofits need money, all that other stuff. They're like wonderful selfies with our Instagram mayor, he loves those too, but that doesn't make it right.
We don't have any government funding.
Okay, that's cool.
As an organization, I respect, I think, your sort of sharing kind of your experience and your thoughts about kind of what the organization does and kind of the relationship between the organization and the state and sort of more generally kind of a different philosophical approach. I disagree as a factual matter about what the organization has done with respect to its work with government agencies, and I also disagree as a philosophical matter as to the approach that we should take towards ending the kind of surveillance that we're talking about. But I don't want to kind of belabor that, but I'm happy to talk about that further.
I wonder if the public had access to these tools just as the law enforcement departments do. What issues are involved in that? I mean, obviously it could create a threat for security in certain instances, but it seemed like that might change the leverage of the whole escalation of this technological development. And I wonder how that's come up and how that can be addressed.
The way to stop surveillance is not more surveillance or more broad surveillance. Like for me, it's the abolition of surveillance. Is how do we get rid of these tools? Because it's kind of like the answer to like guns is more people with like guns to stop the bad people. It's like no. I'm not going to get caught in that crossfire, either intellectually or physically. So I think for me, it's like how do we shift this conversation to the more realistic one of how do we abolish surveillance? How do we shift resources to more life-affirming activities that the state might participate in? Hopefully in a way that isn't, with the burden of the state and the biases the state carries.
The disproportionate use of surveillance against people of color, women of color, Muslims and whatnot. Lots of that is occurring because people who look a lot like me, would say, well, if you don't have anything to hide, how do we raise, it's a practical question, how do we raise the consciousness of those people that are not in here singing to our own choir, those people out there who believe it's necessary, it's needed, and they're willing to break a few eggs to make their omelet. How do we raise their consciousness?
So on the last point, which is that it's we need this stuff. We got to keep our community safe. We got to do these tools are helpful. It's one tool in a toolbox full of all kinds of stuff that we need as cops, right? So just as a factual, empirical matter, right? None of this stuff that we've been talking about has been empirically proven to do any of the kind of like community safety work that police departments often say that it's going to be deployed for. So let me repeat that. In other words, none of these technologies, whether license plate readers, CCTV cameras, any of these things, biometric data collection, none of it has been empirically shown to actually reduce crime in any meaningful way. So the data simply doesn't exist. I'll give you an example. The city of Pasadena has CCTV cameras in public parks, right? It wants to do that. It wants to increase the use of CCTV cameras in public spaces as a way of combating crime. But yet all the data that doesn't come from left organizations, but comes from like police organizations domestically and abroad, particularly in the UK where there's a bunch of CCTV cameras, all the data says that it simply doesn't work, that increased cameras don't reduce crime in the places in which cameras exist. You know what actually CCTV cameras don't reduce crime in these places. What actually reduces crime more than anything else is putting up lights. Right? So if you put up lights, it's way cheaper and actually does that work for you. And cameras don't do that. Right? So it's just like an expensive boondoggle that doesn't actually do any of the work. So just as an empirical matter, what I would say is, show me the data, police chief. You can't, because that data doesn't exist for the vast majority of these tools.
Like
right?
stop me first.
Yeah. In fact, what they'll say to you, so they won't actually use that data. What they'll tell you is, no, this will be useful. Right? Well, I don't actually disagree. Of course it'd be useful to have like all these surveillance tools. It'd be useful to have a DNA sample database of literally everybody here in the hands of the Pasadena Police Department. Of course it'd be useful. The question is not whether it's useful or not. The question is whether it's okay. Whether just as a normative matter, we think it's okay for the government to do this kind of work, right? So it's not to be like, oh yeah, it'd be useful to like save a burning child from a burning building. Yeah, okay. But that's not the question. The question is it okay? As a just like a normative matter, and I don't think anybody would be able to provide me sort of empirical evidence to support it. And if you can't provide the empirical evidence to support it, then you're really just talking out of your gut, and it's just a bunch of truthiness, you know. And I don't think that should create policy.
Yeah. And to the folks who are like nothing to hide, I love those folks because I'm like, give me your phone for 5 minutes. And they're the ones who are like, oh, no. I can't give you my phone. It's like, no, unlock your phone and give it to me for 5 minutes. You have nothing to hide, right?
Well, thank you all.